At the end of World War II, the Americans changed the way the world worked. Before the war, everything was imperial. So there was a Dutch system, a German system, a Russian system, a Japanese system, and so on. And those systems traded very little because if there was a war, even if neither of the traders were involved in it, the supply chain system could be broken down and you would lose access to whatever you needed. So you kept things in-house whenever you could. Now, the Americans changed that system to what we now know as free trade. So the Americans committed their navy, which was really the only one of size to survive the war, so that anyone could go anywhere and interface with any partner and participate in any supply chain or access any raw material if in exchange they lined up with the United States to fight the Soviets in the Cold War. We bribed up an alliance, and that created the world that we know. But as soon as the United States did that, it made it very easy for smaller countries and former colonial possessions to be independent. And so everyone was able to specialize, everyone was able to trade, everyone was able to expand their economic wherewithal. And with that happening everywhere more or less at the same time, people started to use their new income and to move into jobs that were more value add. And so we started moving off the farm and into the cities. And when you live on the farm, you have a lot of kids. But when you live in a city, they're an expense rather than a benefit. And so you have fewer of them. And bit by bit, this system spread around the world until with the fall of the Cold War, it went everywhere. And so we have seen urbanization and industrialization happen on a scale that we never thought was possible. And we've seen birth rates drop to a rate that never existed before in the pre-war situation. And all of these issues come to a head this decade. The Americans have lost interest in maintaining the system. They've elected an anti-globalist 7 times in a row. And now, in the advanced world, there are no longer sufficient young people to even pretend to regenerate the demographic structures moving forward, and they're all moving into mass retirement. And even in the younger countries, they've already aged past the point of potential reconstitution in most cases. So we now have a top-heavy demography that for the last 10 years has generated a lot more capital, because when your kids move out and you haven't retired, you generate a lot of income and you can save it. But those people are all moving into retirement now. So this decade was always going to be the time we hit an investment bust, a production bust, and a consumption bust. And we don't have an economic model that works in that era. And so we're starting from scratch. And the Ukraine war is a hard stop, and coronavirus sped it up by a couple of years. And so here we are.
Yeah.
That's going to be a different answer based on who I speak with, but definitely one of the big themes is, when can we get back to normal? Mm-hmm. And when are we going to find a new balance that works for both the Americans and the Chinese? And those are definitely the wrong questions. The demographic system has tipped already. And so we're never going back to the consumption and production balance that we had in 2019. That got muddled by COVID. We were all worried about other things for 2 years, and in that time we shifted. The Chinese are arguably the biggest beneficiary of the globalized system, and it hasn't really sunk in just how terminal this is going to be for them in every way that you measure it, demographically, economically, culturally, nationally. The Chinese aren't even going to exist as a country, I would say, by the end of the decade. And that's before you start factoring in some of the more acute things that are happening because of the Ukraine war and their disruption to agricultural, industrial, and energy markets, in all cases of which the Chinese are the biggest loser from the war, with the obvious exception of Ukraine itself.
Yeah.
Sure, the technology absolutely plays a role, and it's intertwined into a lot of what I do. The question, of course, is whether or not everyone's at the same technological level or not. So one of the reasons that the Brits were so successful is not only were they an island, so the technologies of deep water navigation worked better for them than they did for anyone else. They were also then the pioneers of what we now call the Industrial Revolution. And for a good century and a half, it really was just them that had mastered those technologies. And so for the purpose of imperial expansion, for a century and a half, the Brits literally brought a gun to a knife fight over and over and over and did very well. But as soon as the technology started to spread to other entities, we went to a broad-scale wars in which the Brits were a player, not the player. And ultimately, we ended up with all the colonies breaking away because even if you're at the top of the line for tech and your opponent is at the bottom of the line, but you're in the same technological suite, then it comes down to things like numbers. And, 30,000 Brits occupied India until they couldn't.
Right. How
I would say that we're well past the point of no return on that. The most recent data we've got out of the Chinese suggests that their population actually peaked back in 2003, and that they've been overcounting their population by perhaps as many as 100 million. All who would have been born since the one-child policy, and most of whom are probably women. So the Chinese demography is actually more terminal already than the German or the Russian or the Korean demography. And that we can see that in adjacent related numbers such as workforce compensation rates. We've seen labor costs in China go up by about a factor of 15 since 1999, but productivity has only doubled. So technology has not gotten its hooks into China to the degree that it's been able to shift the pattern at all. In terms of technology in general, there are a couple things that you need to have a thriving tech sector. You need a lot of young people who are clever, who can interact with one another, highly educated. You need a metric boatload of money, not just for the development of the tech, but for its prototyping and ultimately its installation and operationalization. We don't have that anymore. We've had a baby bust in most of the world that's 50 years old now. There just aren't enough young people in most countries. And now that the baby boomer generation is moving in retirement, there goes the capital base as well. And if you break up the world because of trade tensions or wars, then their ability to even interact at distance becomes constrained. So I expect the pace of tech globally to slow considerably. There will be some places like the United States that this is less true for, because our baby boomers actually had kids. We know them as millennials. And they are now in that stage of their life where the creativity and the interaction is very important. And so it's not like Silicon Valley is going to die here, but it's not going to move forward at the pace that we've become used to. And a lot of the complementary systems around the world that provide either cooperation or competition simply aren't going to be there in a few years. TSMC, the Taiwanese, they're great at semiconductors. No argument there. However, the United States actually produces 55% of the world's semiconductors by value. So if it's going into a cell phone or a server farm or a laptop, it probably comes from the US. The next tier down is where the Taiwanese and the Koreans are. The Japanese are probably up with the United States. And then the mid-tier, which is for like aerospace and cars, that's primarily Thailand and Malaysia. And the low-end stuff, like if you want, I don't know, a smart blender, that's probably coming from China. So all the Internet of Things, that's all the Chinese stuff. I've always been a little dubious of that personally. I don't need a smart refrigerator, but I would argue we can get by without that. Now, there's a lot of pinch points in all of this. But let's talk about Taiwan specifically. If the Chinese were to capture Taiwan tomorrow without a shot being fired, they could not operate TSMC. If they could do something of that technological level, they would have done it years ago already. The Chinese will participate in any manufacturing that they can do. It doesn't matter if it's cost effective. They'll subsidize it because for them it's more an employment issue more than anything else. And the jobs that the United States has lost to China are ones that were in industries where the Chinese can compete.